The Tower of London houses Britain's oldest public museum, the Royal Armouries, exhibiting a magnificent collection of arms and armour dating back to antiquity. Some were recently moved to a specially built new museum in Leeds, where these historic objects, drawn from around the world, can be better displayed. The master of the Royal Armouries is Guy Wilson.
Of all the weapons in our historic collection, it is the sword that has had the greatest impact on human imagination. It symbolized power, bravery, loyalty, honor, justice, fate, even God. What is it about the sword that has made it such a potent symbol in so many cultures and civilizations?
Ancient gods and heroes, and then those fearless warriors of the classical worlds of Greece and Rome fought with the sword. The weapon demanded high skill, resolute courage, fighting face to face with your opponent. Sword skills had to be stylishly mastered. Technique and deftness. Educated gentlemen learned hard and practiced and practiced. In Europe, the sword, the simple sword, provoked debate, spurred arguments about how it should be used. The Japanese already knew. They had an answer. Unchanged for 1,000 years, the supreme edged weapon, esteem for the warrior, prestige for the samurai. The sword is a powerful symbol of rank and office, carried today with pride by officer cadets at the military colleges of Sandhurst in Britain and at West Point in the United States. Officers whose military careers will be dominated by state-of-the-art computer-controlled weapons, who will probably only ever see the enemy on a radar screen, still parade with a drawn sword. The links with the past are too strong to break. During its long history, the sword's shape and function has altered many times, fueling a debate that has lasted thousands of years. How is the sword best used? As a cutting weapon or a thrusting weapon? Or should it both cut and thrust? We don't know when the first crude metal blade became a sword, but the storytellers of ancient Greece described their warriors in shining bronze armor, carrying a powerful sword by their side.
This is a single-edged weapon, developed in Italy possibly about 600, 700 BC, but was adopted by the Greeks in the classical period about 500, 600 BC. It was essentially a slashing weapon. You could thrust, but it was difficult. It is weighted, as you can see, up towards here, so that when you actually swing it, it gets a momentum of its own. It can cause terrible damage. The earlier versions of it were very, very thick here, and were like a butcher's cleaver. You can imagine about cutting up meat with it. Tremendously heavy they were.
Although this curved sword is a famous weapon of the Greek warrior, it wasn't the first Greek sword of myth and legend.
This is the first real sword. The earlier swords, their handle was made separately, but in this particular type, the metal of the blade goes right the way through the handle so that you are gripping the blade, giving you a very secure grip. It comes from the late Bronze Age. This is about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, and it is the weapon of the great heroes of Greece, people like Achilles and Odysseus. It's both a thrusting and a chopping weapon, so you can thrust like that, or you can slash like that.
But bronze swords, as this unique test shows, will bend. This must have been a severe disadvantage on the battlefield. It took several hundred years to develop a stronger weapon.
This is the sword that developed out of the Bronze Age sword. It's made in iron now. It's very similar in shape, being slightly wasted with a fairly long point. It went on to be used widely across Europe, and was taken up by the Romans in the early period until about 200 BC when they adopted the famous Spanish sword.
The Roman army, more than any other in the ancient world, had a talent for adapting the weapons of its enemies.
This is the Gladius Hispaniensis, the Spanish sword. This is the sword that conquered the world. It is a wonderful weapon with two very effective cutting edges and a long thrusting point. The Romans had previously to this used the Greek sword, but this suited their style of fighting totally. The Romans were smaller men, and they needed to be able to get in under the enemy guard, straight up into the stomach.
By the 1st century AD, the mighty Roman Empire covered much of Europe and the Middle East. Its highly disciplined army fought in tight formation with this shorter sword that suited the close order of its legions. It was used successfully until the 5th century AD, the end of the Roman Empire. The barbarians who followed, like the Vikings, had longer slashing swords which they imbued with an almost religious status.
Every Viking worth his salt would have a sword if he thought of himself as a warrior, though obviously there was a certain class of society which didn't think of themselves as warriors. They would only have spears. But if you thought of yourself as a warrior, you would have a sword and you would treasure it, you would regard it as something important to your identity, and you would probably give it a name. The sword was the essence of warriorness, if you like, and every warrior would practice with his sword a great deal. He would go through various training exercises and games, mock duels with his friends, and possibly have quite a high casualty rate in the process. Viking swords very much for cutting rather than thrusting. It didn't have to have a sharp point. It didn't even have to have a sharp blade, although that helped. But the main impact of the sword was when you slashed at someone and bashed through his skull or his arm or his leg. It was for a hard hit.
This rare 8th or 9th century sword has only survived because it was dropped into a river, perhaps as part of some religious rite or victory ceremony. Water was very important to the Celts, Vikings and Saxons. In the legend of King Arthur, his famous sword Excalibur was thrown into the lake at his death. Swords were highly valued because they were so well made, but as techniques changed, many of the skills of early swordsmiths were never passed on.
It's a tradition which died out in Europe about 900 or more years ago, and it was never written down, so we've no idea. They're lost skills. It's a lost society. We really know very little about it. And what we're trying to do is to rediscover the skills.
Only now, gradually, with a combination of scientific analysis and practical experiment, are we slowly discovering some of the ancient secrets of sword making. This blacksmith is one of a number trying to recapture the lost techniques of the early smiths. He has great respect for their skills.
Medieval swordsman's skill, even by today's standards, was of exceptional quality. Very few people can enact what they were able to do 1,200 years ago, 2,000 years ago. The reason for bending and folding and turning it back on itself is basically you're cleansing the steel. The strength of the steel lay in its fibre and its carbon content, but to improve it, you simply folded the material and it cleansed it and developed its ability to cut.
They're very difficult to make, I think. Modern smiths have had a lot of problems trying to reconstruct the methods used by early smiths. Even researchers tend to think of the iron makers as rather primitive, working with little bits of metal, much as the Japanese sword masters still do when they're combining the special steels and so on. It's a big misconception, and I think it's partly because the Romans viewed everybody outside their empire as primitive barbarians, which they clearly weren't. Particularly the Celtic societies were highly sophisticated people, even if they weren't literate, and they were able to make things well. And what we found so far is that 4 types of iron and steel were used. Because they were 4 different types, they can't have all been made in one place. They must form part of a trade network. So this isn't the work of primitive smiths working in one place. It's a highly organised society.
Part of the swordsmith's skill is shaping the tang, around which the hilt of the sword will be formed. It's drawn from the blade until narrow enough to accommodate a hand grip.
The tang has to be designed in a very particular way because actually the energy that you put into the striking of a blade against an assailant or another person's sword or whatever ends up in the tang, and the energy has to be manipulated in a particular way, else you simply break the handle off. And so the tang was always considered to be the very, very softest part of the sword. The magic of the sword on the battlefield was prestige. Actually, most men died with hammers and axes and such like, but the sword was a famous symbol of status.
The sword's mystique didn't disappear with Dark Age warriors like the Vikings. The medieval knight also lived and died by the sword. To the medieval knight, as for the Dark Age warriors before him, the sword symbolized his honor, his status, and his skill. By the 15th century, most swords were made with sharp points to thrust and cut, and some were larger, to be used with two hands. In skilled hands, even these bigger swords were fast and deadly. The 15th century may have been called an age of chivalry, but when two knights fought, they used skill, strength, and guile to win. These two-handed swords were formidable weapons, about 1.5 meters long and weighing over 2 kilos. They were not the slow, awkward weapons of Hollywood fantasy. They were cleverly designed so the long blade was balanced by a long grip, with the counterweight of a rounded pommel at the end. The result, a powerful and fast weapon that could easily be used with practice. These rare European 15th century illustrations offer modern researchers a unique insight into medieval swordsmanship. They come from a very small number of surviving early sword manuals that show different types of swords being used for different types of combat. These medieval swordsmen worked for the Royal Armouries. They are highly trained, and with the help of the original manuals, strive to interpret accurately real medieval sword-fighting techniques. They're taught by fight choreographer and head of interpretation at the Royal Armouries, John Waller.
At this moment, according to the manuscripts, these are the two guards we're going to take. But we know that he's taking that guard. Where are you going for this particular move?
For the head.
Right, go for the head slowly. Now, Henry knows that you're going for his head. Because we're not trying to kill each other, the tendency is to miss his head. Therefore, Henry doesn't move out of the way. So that if I can just take Henry's position, if you go for my head and I don't, this side, Henry, isn't it? If I don't move, you go for my head, then I have to step. But if I'm standing here and you know you're going to miss me up here, then I don't step, and it hits the sword. So we just got to take it that bit further.
Here, the swordsmen are slowly constructing a sequence that makes the moves flow from one known position to another. Only when they've practiced each attack and counter-attack do the interpreters put a fight sequence together. The drawings show the start, the main attack, and defense and end positions, but they rarely put the moves together in an actual sequence. The whole exercise gives new insights into some forgotten skills of fighting with a two-handed sword.
If Henry was to come down to my head and I tried to do this and then tried to do the hammer, it wouldn't flow. What we're working out from the sequences is that when Henry comes down to my head and you parry, what it does is it takes you quickly into the next move. What they also don't know is that we're going to punch in the face with this, which nobody expects. Or we could be doing this and Henry would be doing this. So you're using it like a bayonet, like a club, like an axe, but also they're so maneuverable you can use them in one hand. And we hope that hopefully these are just as exciting and just as deadly to use as a Japanese sword.
The old illustrations brought to life by these trained interpreters reveal that medieval swordsmen were highly skilled, and they knew the best way to exploit their weapons' potential. The feared Japanese samurai warriors honed and perfected their fighting skills over hundreds of years. The Japanese sword is different from the European sword and is used differently. Drawing it from the scabbard can be the most crucial move, as it develops into the first and sometimes only cut. This one-cut approach bears little resemblance to Western notions of swordsmanship.
Swordplay, as it's known in the West, where the combatants draw their swords, attack each other, work for an opening by parrying and feinting and thrusting, is almost unknown in Japan. A lot of attacks were made actually from the draw, where the swordsman drew the sword and immediately cut his opponent. If he had to block an opponent's blade or parry it, the one problem was that the cutting edge was too brittle to take it. So instead he had to use either the face of the blade or its back. The Japanese sword is not just a weapon, although it's probably the most efficient hand-to-hand fighting weapon the world has ever seen. It is as well a consummate art object, an expression of beauty, a thing of endless fascination. They're still made in exactly the same way as they were 1,000 years ago today.
The skills that produced Dark Age swords were lost as later European swordsmiths strove to keep up with technological advances and changing fashions. But in Japan, sword making and the spiritual process surrounding it remains unchanged.
Most Japanese swordsmiths tend towards the Shinto religion in Japan, and therefore the process of forging a sword is seen in Shinto terms. The spirits of earth, the ore from which the iron is made, fire, water and air all enter into the manufacture of the sword, and therefore to the Japanese mind these spirits are imbued in the final blade. Even today, in a modern swordsmith's workshop, you'll always find a Shinto shrine somewhere inside it.
The sword makers pay their respects to the Shinto shrine before they begin to work the metals that will eventually form the blade.
The swordsmith selects pieces of high carbon steel, welds them into a block, which he then hammers out and folds repeatedly, each time reducing the carbon content and at the same time making the metal homogeneous.
This folding process is repeated over and over again to remove as many impurities as possible and spread those that remain around. Eventually, a steel blade is produced that is both resilient and hard enough to cut through armor.
The Japanese devised a technique over 1,000 years ago of heat treating the sword so that only the cutting edge was hardened and the back of the sword remained soft to support the cutting edge. You can see this if you look at a sword in that the cutting edge appears as a misty white area in contrast to the rest of the blade.
To achieve this effect, a mixture of clay, charcoal and powdered polishing stone is applied to the blade. A thin layer allows it to harden, and a thicker layer, applied to the back of the blade, keeps this area softer and lets the sword curve.
Japanese swordsmiths evolved this curved shape over 1,000 years ago, and later swordsmiths failed to improve upon it. A lot of the curvature actually arises during the tempering process. While the blade is hot, it tends to be almost straight. And as it cools, the back contracts more than the cutting edge, which gives it this nice, even curve.
The skills of the polisher are almost as important as the swordsmiths. These revered craftsmen undergo years of training to perfect their art. The swordsmith produces a blade with an extremely hard and lasting edge. polishing then enhances its famed cutting power. The polisher sits on a stool that places him directly above the polishing stone, so he can properly control the difficult and delicate task of giving the blade its final polish.
This particular blade, which is about 500 years old and which was carried in the war, still has plenty of cutting ability. One of the important points when cutting is that the blade moves relative to the cut. And a swordsman, when he's cutting, will either advance towards the cut or move away from it. But if the cut is dead, it has no effect at all. Because it is curved, it's primarily suited to cutting. It's very difficult, although not impossible, to thrust with a Japanese sword. But it does require a trained swordsman to use it effectively.
The inscription made on the tang, onto which the grip is fitted, records who has made the sword, when and where it was made, and sometimes who it was made for. This was important for the samurai, as the sword was said to represent his soul. It was at the very core of his character. Dried fish skin from ray or shark is used to cover the wooden handle of the sword. Fish skin is an extremely tough material, with a grain and rough surface that gives the swordsman a good grip. The hilt maker is one of 5 specialist craftsmen. He covers the grip in silk braid, which can reflect the rank of the owner. The scabbard is made of wood by another craftsman, working in the traditional way. The wood is carefully planed to be completely flat and smooth. It must be a perfect fit for the sword, because so much of the Japanese swordsman's technique depends on being able to draw the sword quickly and effortlessly in one move to make the first cut count. According to Japanese tradition, the sword is dreadful, beautiful, and holy. It's treated with exceptional reverence by the swordsman before he begins a series of slow, disciplined, and formal cutting exercises. These movements never vary. A few hundred years ago, new swords could, at a price, be fully tested on the corpses of executed prisoners. This process was called tameshigiri. Some blades that had performed particularly well would be engraved with "cut through 3 bodies" or "cut through both hip bones." For over 1,000 years, the Japanese have crafted one of the most efficient self-defense weapons ever made. But in Europe, as we see in the next episode of The sword's shape and use was still at the center of a stubborn debate.
Across many cultures and continents, the sword of all arms has been the weapon of the hero and the warrior. From ancient times, as we saw in the last episode, the sword has been both cherished as a potent weapon and charged with deep symbolism by those who made it and those who used it.
In an age of computer-controlled missiles and automatic weapons, these officer cadets at Sandhurst still parade with a drawn sword. The sword has always been the prince of weapons, its links with the past too strong to break. Warriors and heroes of ancient Greece fought with swords, but when made of bronze, not iron, they could bend in battle. Roman iron swords were sturdier, and the short stabbing and slashing sword, the Gladius Hispaniensis, conquered and dominated a great empire. The Vikings had a longer slashing sword with a fearsome reputation. And in these dark ages, Viking and Saxon swords were imbued with an almost religious significance. They were highly prized and beautifully crafted objects. Although how these swords were made is a mystery to modern smiths. who tried to recapture the lost techniques of ancient swordmakers, whose skills were kept a closely guarded secret and were never passed on. The Japanese, however, still make swords in exactly the same way they were made over 1,000 years ago, the skills handed down from one generation to the next. Producing a strong, sharp, hard-edged blade that can cut through Japanese armor. And the samurai warrior developed a technique that is also unchanged. He draws and immediately cuts his opponent with one economical stroke of the blade. European swordsmanship has a very different story. Wielding medieval swords needed training to master complicated strokes and moves. But as we see in this episode, the sword's shape and its use was to change again and again.
In Europe, the sword was for centuries the weapon used to defend one's honor. But it also continued to be used in battle, especially by cavalry. And a debate raged about whether the sword was best used for cutting or for thrusting, or whether it should do both. A debate which rumbled on until the beginning of the 20th century.
For thousands of years, most European noblemen could wield a sword with some skill. These modern Olympic fencers are part of that tradition, as they concentrate on a series of moves that thrust the point of their foils to touch their opponents. Young Renaissance gentlemen were taught to fight with skill and efficiency. In late 16th century England, the broad-bladed sword was still in vogue, and young men learnt to use it with both cuts and thrusts. But swords and sword fighting were susceptible to fashion. Historical evidence for this can be found in William Shakespeare's plays. At the Royal Armoury's new museum in Leeds, live demonstrations of scenes from Romeo and Juliet show how Shakespeare used these changing fashions to entertain his audiences.
For instance, Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 1, begins with the stage directions, "Enter Samson and Gregory from the house of Capulet, bearing swords and bucklers." Now this is a reference to the traditional English combination of broad-bladed sword and rounded shield, weapons that were common amongst civilians of the lower classes, such as servants and apprentices, and also commonly used on the battlefield. And they were employed in a style which mixed both cuts and thrusts from the sword with deflective beats and punches from the buckler. And later in this first scene, when Samson and Gregory draw on Abraham and Balthazar from the house of Montague, Samson urges his friend to use the time-honored cut when he yells, "Remember thy swashing blow!"
Fashionable Tudor gentlemen learned to sword fight in many ways, using everything at their disposal, including daggers. They employed a range of thrusting and cutting techniques. But some young men were increasingly attracted to the elegance of the much longer, narrower sword that was all the rage on the continent, particularly in Italy.
Now, the Italian masters favoured the stabbing power of the narrow-bladed rapiers, which, in accordance with the dictates of fashion, had grown to a length that many thought ridiculous, some considerable inches in excess of the ones we hold here. But still, many young men visited Italy and so learnt the Italian vogue, with many then returning back to this country convinced that this new stabbing method was more effective than their native cut and thrust.
The first Italian master to actually settle in England was Signor Rocco, who arrived around 1570 and established an expensive and exclusive fence school in London's Blackfriars. And it was he who boasted that he could hit with a thrust any Englishman just upon any button on his doublet. Shakespeare recollects this scornfully later when he has Mercutio, called Tybalt, the very butcher of a silk button.
But some traditional masters-at-arms thought if all a swordsman lost was a button on his doublet, he was lucky, because only thrusting and not cutting with the sword was to risk his life.
the Englishman George Silver, who was writing late in the 16th century. He's very antagonistic to what he regards as these foreigners, these foreign Italians coming in with their newfangled, long, thrusting weapons, these rapiers, and he advocates the good old English short sword as being the weapon which is really effective.
Now, Silver was, above all, a pragmatic man who truly believed that cuts, his downright blows, were as quick, if not quicker than thrusts, and delivered a more immediately disabling wound, and were therefore a much better defence.
Besides, in the words of George Silver, these days there are no gripes, closers, wrestling, striking with the hilt, striking with the foot or knee in the cods.
But one of the things that Silver says, which is extremely interesting, but slightly ambiguous, but it's very interesting historically, is he criticises the Italians because of their concentration on offence. He says that all they can do is attack, and anybody who fights with these weapons is going to get killed or be killed or whatever. And he says they don't teach how to defend yourself.
The debate about whether cutting or thrusting or both was truly the best fighting technique continued long after the 16th century. But when real sword fights took place, even the most refined and educated gentlemen fought to win, with whatever was at hand.
This argument about cutting and thrusting, the use of the edge and use of the point, although there is this overall development towards concentration on thrusting rather than cutting, there were always people who recognized that the sword had these capacities, and one or two masters actually made this point that a sword had two edges and a point, and that they were all capable of being used and should be used as and when required.
But no matter what some swordmasters said, or even what common sense dictated, few fashionable Stuart gentlemen would be seen using slashing and cutting strokes. Their swords had to have long, narrow blades, and were best used for thrusting. An 18th century dandy would take as much care choosing his sword as he would his extravagant wardrobe. How he looked reflected his wealth and his taste. Even a salute to an opponent required a number of complicated and exaggerated movements with his sword. Fencing schools in this period thrived, and none more than the Angelo family's establishment in London. Young men spent hours practicing with the famous swordmasters of the day, using blunted swords aimed only at the chest. This stylized method evolved into the modern sport of fencing. Learning these sword techniques was considered an essential part of their education as gentlemen. It was also essential training for survival, for this was the age of the duel, and if challenged, a gentleman was expected to defend his honour by risking his life. These practice sessions used a real sword with a sharp point, and now the target was all parts of the body, not just the chest. As one contemporary writer put it, to wear a sword is only fashionable, to use it is necessary. With all its overtones of romance, honour and courage, many people died or were seriously injured when fighting a duel. This sword duel is a recreation of a real event that took place in 1772. It was fought between a Mr. Matthews, who was challenged by the playwright Richard Sheridan, because Matthews had made an ungentlemanly comment about Sheridan's intended wife. The remark was considered insulting enough for both of them to agree to a duel with swords. A duel was a formal affair with its own etiquette. Most importantly, not accepting the challenge risked the grave charge of cowardice and being socially ostracized. A man who lost his position in society lost everything, and it was this fear that drove many men to a pointless death. Matthews and Sheridan were not noted swordsmen or natural duelists. Indeed, Sheridan, a popular playwright of the day, had ridiculed dueling in one of his recent productions. Like many duels, once the fighting had started, it did not last long. In fact, it was all over very quickly. Sheridan, delighted, disarmed Matthews, who retracted his comments, which should have been the end of it. But Sheridan made Matthews' apology public, claiming he had begged for his life, and Matthews, shamed, was forced to challenge him to another duel. The second duel between Matthews and the playwright Sheridan was also short, but extremely brutal. Both men determined to settle the business as quickly as possible. Ironically, a stroke of bad luck came to Matthews' aid. His sword broke, but he closed and used it to batter and stab Sheridan, who was badly hurt. The playwright did recover and married the woman whose honour he had defended. The concept of honour that had to be satisfied and the ready availability of confident swordsmen made such dangerous duels all too common.
The famous Angela, the great teacher in 18th century England, who had this famous fencing school, had many pupils, many of whom fought duels. And only one of those pupils fought a duel with swords. All their duels were fought with pistols. Now, I mean, that seems to me to be quite significant.
Why gentlemen practiced in sword skills would want to risk their lives using pistols that could be unreliable is curious. But many did, like these two men in 1803. The weapons were flintlocks, specialist dueling pistols made by English gunsmiths to the highest quality for what was an illegal activity. Once loaded, the etiquette of the duel entitled the challenger to choose his pistol first. Both duelists were officers, and both had agreed to risk their lives over a dog. Captain McNamara took insult because Colonel Montgomery had beaten his dog. An account of the time put it, "Here were notables who had passed through many a peril in their country's cause, full of merit and honour, and now, having lowered themselves by an unseemly squabble in public, have resolved to break the laws of God and their country." Montgomery died. McNamara was arrested and then acquitted.
I think that the most important thing to grasp about swordsmanship, the history of swordsmanship, particularly from medieval right through, say, into the 18th century, is that it is largely aggressive and offensive, a self-preservation art, and a killing art. I think that this is very largely what a good deal of the fencing schools did, so that you produce people who have a technical ability to wield a lethal weapon. Some of them are probably psychopathic. Well, I think some of the professional duelists, certainly in the 16th and 17th century, clearly are psychopaths who simply enjoy the business of provoking quarrels and killing people.
Although dueling was illegal, men continued to fight and kill. Some were arrested and tried for murder, but courts, swayed by stories of heroic behaviour or of bravery on the battlefield, often acquitted the accused.
This is a mode of fighting which is intended for keeps. I mean, they're aiming to kill or to maim their opponents. And although, of course, practicing would be, as in any activity, is obviously exercise and probably quite enjoyable, but it's also pretty lethal. They're aiming really to prepare people to fight partly on the field of battle in earlier days, but mainly to defend themselves in the street, in situations where you've got to be quick and deadly.
By the late 19th century, the banned practice of duelling had almost gone out of fashion. But the Victorian gentleman might still carry a blade for protection, though now it was much more discreet. The sword stick was literally a narrow-bladed sword concealed in a walking stick. From the outside it appeared harmless, but inside was a deadly weapon. A gentleman wandering in the dark and foggy back streets of a Victorian city needed to protect himself against potential muggers and thieves who might be lurking around any corner. The sword stick was perfect for his self-defense. Being able to wield a sword was the mark of a gentleman throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and into the 20th. Even today, it still confers an authority that no other weapon can hope to match. The sword was not only the weapon of the gentleman, it was also particularly valued by the military, and above all by the cavalrymen, for whom cold steel remained the best possible weapon.
The debate over cut versus thrust was particularly important for the cavalry. The survival of horse cavalry until well on in the 20th century isn't just yet another example of military pig-headedness. As late as 1914, and in some areas beyond it, there were certain jobs on the battlefield that only the cavalry could do, like scouting and pursuit. And as long as you had horse cavalry, there was a case, although always a disputed one, for issuing them with the cold steel.
In the early 19th century, the light cavalryman carried a curved sword. It was elegant in design and proved truly formidable as an excellent cutting weapon. At this time, it was widely believed that this was the cavalry sword's primary purpose. The argument was that cutting at the enemy was far more effective than trying to deliver carefully aimed thrusts directly into them. The slow-motion camera shows just how surprisingly flexible the blade is. It took great skill to produce a long piece of tempered steel that could take this punishment time and time again and spring back straight for more. Cavalrymen learned 6 carefully prescribed sword cuts to perfect their cutting techniques. These exercises were not haphazard cuts and slashes. Each stroke was carefully defined and described in a manual. The rider had to deliver his practiced cuts charging at speed, while keeping good control of his horse. By the time of the Crimean War, in the middle of the 19th century, a straighter blade was being used. This was another attempt to find the perfect cavalry sword, which it was now fashionable to believe should be able to both cut and deliver a killing thrust. The British Army authorities worked hard to find and develop the ideal shape for a sword that could do both. But inevitably, it was a compromise. As a slashing sword, this 1853 pattern worked, but as a thrusting weapon, it was not so successful. Some regiments complained that when thrusting and then withdrawing the blade at a gallop, the preferred speed of the cavalry charge, the blade bent and became useless, putting soldiers' lives in danger. After a number of other attempts to produce a cut and thrust sword, the army decided to commission a weapon designed only to thrust. The result, according to some, was the best cavalry sword ever produced.
In 1908, the British Army adopted this, and the Americans, interestingly, adopted a very similar weapon shortly afterwards. It's designed purely for thrusting. It's got an offset hilt and a mark for the thumb, so that the arm comes naturally up for the thrust.
The blade is narrow and very stiff with a good sharp point, perfect for thrusting. Thrusting, experts now believed, was the most effective means of attack, but it was a dangerous maneuver on horseback. The cavalryman's sword was attached to his wrist to stop it being pulled out of his hand when he thrust, and he then had to withdraw his weapon after an attack without being unhorsed.
It's an interesting comment on military technology, that this, arguably the most effective sword ever used by the British Army, was introduced at a time when the weapon itself was becoming obsolete.
The cavalryman was riding towards a new era of warfare, one that had no time for the speed of the horse, the magnetism of the charge, or the terror of cold steel. Though the cavalryman may have disappeared from the battlefield, the sword remains.
The sword was more, much more, than just a weapon. At one level, it was a symbol of power and authority. Long, straight bearing swords were carried in front of kings, princes, and even civic dignitaries, signifying the power of life and death. On the continent, men were usually beheaded by the sword rather than the axe, and one of the privileges of being a nobleman was that you got beheaded, not hanged. In the army, the sword was the mark of the commissioned officer. Because the sword was a symbol of honor and dignity, when an officer was ceremonially deprived of his commission, the ceremony often resulted in his sword being snapped, a symbol of the fact that he was no longer a gentleman. Happily, the converse is true. At Britain's Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, the best officer cadet of his intake is given, on commissioning, the Sword of Honor. That really says it all.
Of all weapons, the sword has had the greatest impact on our imagination. As a weapon, it is obsolete, yet it remains an object of irresistible potency. As a ceremonial weapon, it has no equal, its form and function perfectly matched. As the flag flies over the parading officer cadets now facing their challenging futures, they are watched over by the sword, the ultimate symbol of power, loyalty, bravery, and honor.